Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I would like to address you in regards to the 12th day of what I like to call Black Excellence Month, otherwise known as Black History Month. It is February 12th, and today I will be saving some space in appreciation for my most favorite president of all time, Abraham Lincoln. And the reason why this is important to me to share, because there's something really special about what Lincoln was able to secure for America. I mean, when we think about him, we often think about the Civil War. He was a wartime president, and we think about how he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and we think of how John Wilkes Booth shot him in the head while he was at a play. And those are like the main things that most people think of when they think of Lincoln. And you know, I can remember in school, I think it was about like 8 or 9, and I moved a lot, so I went to lots of different schools, but I was about 8 or 9 when I really took notice of Abraham Lincoln. We were learning about him in school, and there was just something that struck me like, oh my gosh, how fortunate America has been to have a president that was as thoughtful and caring and composed as Lincoln was. I mean, he toiled over, probably one of the hardest things that a president would ever have to endure. How do you be the leader of a nation that is infighting with itself based off of these different ideals of wanting to take the nation in one direction, and then recognizing that we really need to lead forward in a new direction, you know, if we are going to ever stand a chance of, you know, making it. And so I remember learning about Lincoln, and I was just like so blown away. Even as a young kid, I was like, wow, a president could do all that. You know, and then learning over the years of his knack for oratory, and the fact that he really embraced who he was and his awkwardness, and he led forward with that as his strength, and he was able to captivate audiences during his campaigning through doing debates, not because he was well known or, you know, greatly admired and had a bunch of accolades, or, you know, had a bunch of people standing beside him, but he spoke directly for the people, in a sense of like, he claimed the platform and gave voice to what everybody was thinking, but not enough people were speaking out about, because it was a difficult time. You know, the question of racism and slavery was a hot button topic, and it got a lot of people revved up about it, but it was just such a contentious concept that many people like pushed it aside and didn't want to think about it. They didn't want to take a stance, and they didn't want to take a side because it just all seemed so, muddled. And many of the high-profile people who had platforms and, voices and opinions really tried to cast it in a light as if America ought to interpret the Constitution as if America never intended for all people to be equal, and that is why many African Americans were dehumanized and spoken as if they were beasts. They were treated like animals and reflected in that way. And they did that in order to give a basis of justification to reconcile the hypocrisies of our founding ideals, our founding principles, our founding mission statements that said all people are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And the only way to reconcile the fact that the entire Black population was denied life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was to treat them as if they weren't human. And here you have out on the main public stage a white man standing up for the ideals, not off of some sense of principle of as if he was like this staunch ally for Black people. It's like, this is wrong, Black people deserve better. It was more just like, the only way that your argument about the justifying of dehumanizing Black people in order for, you to get past the, difficultness of explaining away why these people don't have the things that our founding principles say is due to all people, is that you have to interpret it with this racist veil, and that everybody would have to operate off of that assumption that that is the way that you must perceive a person of color. And Lincoln was like, it's not very logical. That's why I liked him so much. He was such a logical person. He was caring and he was compassionate, but he was logical. And he was just like, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. Here you are saying, oh, Constitution, live by it, stand by it, firm and true. But then you are choosing to interpret it in such a way that imposes upon it a meaning that never was there. And bless the hearts of the crafters of the Declaration and the Constitution who left enough of the gray area so that recognizing at the founding of the nation, it was just way too much to create a united front to say all people are equal, we're abolishing slavery. It was a thing they knew they had to set up for the potential for it to be reconciled later, but it was going to have to be somebody else's problem because we had to be able to start where we were. And the whole process of evolving civil society away from racism and slavery was going to be an evolutionary course. And the founding fathers knew that. even though they themselves were slave owners, they knew it wasn't going to last. And I believe many of them in their hearts didn't want it to last. But what are you going to do? You can't get an entire nation to come to terms all of a sudden, say, we shall never do this again. We're stopping right now, clean slate. They knew that this was the way things were. But they were not the way things were going to continue to be. And the idea is that, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were going to be, for everybody eventually. And that's why they carved out space for there to be amendments, because they knew the Constitution had to evolve with the changing of the times, befit the times. And the interpretation of the Constitution had to befit the times as well. So when Lincoln steps on the scene, he's saying, here are all these people who are just holding on to, slavery being, necessary. We don't have to change it. This is the way it always has been, the way it always should be. This is a good arrangement. Discounting and disqualifying all of the people of color because it would have been inconvenient or uncomfortable, or difficult or challenging for the white people who owned slaves to be able to reconcile and live out a new life. But the thing is that the freedom for slaves was occurring without even, the law saying, that you have to, give them their freedom. Many of them were given their freedom. And so the sentiment, the sensibilities, the conscience of the people was already evolving and changing. But there was kind of a rut that occurred that was kind of holding back progress, and it really was the fact that legislation had not caught up with the times of people kind of waking up into this new conscience of saying, well, that's not really right, is it? You see how hard, people of color were working, how talented they were, how skilled they were, how caring and compassionate they were. They were capable people, and they were brilliant, they were resilient. What was there to not love, respect, and appreciate about them? Other than this arbitrary sense of skin color, this superficiality, and the technicalities of they weren't educated, they didn't know any better, or, trying to say that they were, unintelligible people, like they didn't know how to, be refined in society. It was well, if you create the conditions by which somebody, is, disposed to this way of living and growing up, and you conform them and constrain them and you limit them and you prevent them and you make rules against them doing, things that would help them to grow, like learning how to read and to write, and prevent them from going to school and these sorts of things, literally making laws to confine and constrain these people, recognizing they were full of potential, and if they got out of hand, many white people were worried that the blacks would raise up against them violently because they had done so much violence to the black people, and thinking that, they didn't want to suffer the consequences of the karmatic retribution of time. Would the black people be justified in retaliation and vengeance? Some say they would have been, but the great thing about it is that so many people from, the times of slavery who were slaves really leaned into their religion. It was this healing balm. It was the thing that gave them strength and got them through. And many of them were able to, as hard as it was, were able to reconcile and understand that even though these people have hurt you, that does not mean that you have some sort of, right to retaliate against them. To the eye for the eye turns the whole world blind sort of thing. But there was a resistance that was building up, and African American people were like, we're not okay with this arrangement anymore. We deserve to have a shot at life too. The Constitution that y'all are saying you're protected by and that gives you legitimacy as a nation, the nation that we are building up with our hands, you would be nothing without us. You're denying us that right too, because of some, arbitrary sense of, superficial way of looking at something. And then these laws that limit people, it's like, if those barriers were not created, those laws were not created in order to constrain and confine and limit and oppress, there was literally nothing stopping, people of color ascending to higher, levels of achievement and success and brilliance. And we have proof of that today. So many brilliant people, descendants of slaves who have, overcome. They sang their songs and their hymns, and they made it through with this strength and resilience. I mean, and I really think that's what Lincoln tuned into. He had this sensibility, like, this ain't right, guys. This is dumb. The way you're interpreting the Constitution doesn't even make sense, and we're not going to lose out on anything if Black people are brought into the full meridian of society. Yeah, you're not going to be able to have a slave that you can beat and push around and whatever, but it's like, we shouldn't have a society that allows for violence just to happen or whatever. That does something to the mind, man, and it makes people crazy. And if we're gonna achieve a more perfect union and become a more civil society, man, we can't just have people being violent all the time to certain portions of the population, because if they think they can get away with it there, they're gonna do it over here too. And it's like, we gotta squash all that if we're ever going to become civilized, And, so his stance wasn't like some kind of champion for Black rights. It was more just like, logically, this doesn't even make sense. We're, hypocrites, and we're contradicting our own Constitution. We're basically, taking all of the bad things that we complained about, all these oppressive things that we were running away from and dissolving our connections and our ties from with, this oppressive, country that was ruling us from afar and, making everything like a challenging situation for us and, making things more frustrating than they had to be and oppressing us and taking our rights, all those things. We sent a big middle finger to all that and we declared independence. But now here we are trying to say, somehow that we have the right to be as much of assholes as, this nation that we, separated ourselves from. And, the hypocrisy was just so evident to Lincoln. He was calling out the bullshit and saying, there's a way to come to terms. There's a way, and he tried to just be like, well, maybe we can just, allow for it to exist free space in some places, but other states can have their own type of sovereignty or whatever, and maybe that separation, it can appease those who, think, this is just the way it's got to be. We like it this way, and we're not willing to change. But there are other people that are ready to advance the nation and evolve us forward and become more civilized and perfect our union, which is about, wholly encompassing the spirit of intent of our founding of independence and liberty and freedom and justice for all and all of these things. And, that didn't work out. Obviously, we had a civil war. Basically over that contention of where, Lincoln had to come to terms, and I'm sure it was a great struggle. It's like, you know, I very much think he probably had some sort of like moral dilemma that he went through in his head of kind of like, you know, he either had to be president of all or he was no president at all. And so he was trying to find this medium, the space of like, you know, how can we coexist with these two opposing ideals? And, you know, he really worked the problem. And fortunately, he was able to keep an open ear to people and, you know, society and these intelligent minds and segregationists and, you know, abolitionists the same, and just kind of like, okay, well, you know, where's the overlap in that, you know? And he listened to bright minds, and he realized, you know, as more contentions came up and, you know, infighting and conflict based off of the misunderstandings of how can we all just get along despite the fact that we're trying to take the nation in different directions, he came to terms like, you know, people saw in Lincoln the care and the sensibilities of like, he was willing to work the problem. He wasn't going to run away from it. He wasn't going to push it under the rug. You know, he wasn't going to just, you know, give in to whoever put the most pressure on him. You know, he was going to try to find a way to reconcile all of this. And he was willing to, you know, live up to the task, as challenging as it was. He was an extraordinary man, you know, not without flaws or errors, and he made mistakes, and many things could have been preventable that ended up becoming disastrous by poor decision making on his behalf. And I think the advancement of, you know, freedom and liberty in the truest sense for people of color was not given the best advantage forward for a lot of the reasons of, you know, how do you reconcile all these things and suit the sensibilities of people that can actually grasp this sense of like, okay, this is what our new law precedent is going to be, and so from here on we have to behave in a new way, and we're going to have to like fix all of those shortfalls in the systems that are literally, we are breaking them down. And so we were set back in many ways because there was not enough of a big grand strategy in terms of how to like really truly work out the evolutionary development of full integration. And we still struggle with that today. But, you know, Lincoln, for all that he did do, he gave a really, really good step forward. You know, he created a keystone in the Emancipation Proclamation to set into motion the capacity for liberty and justice for all. And I think of him often in terms of like, I wonder what he would think of in our nation if he were here now, other than the like, wow, you know, like, look where you guys took this. This is crazy, you know, technological advancements and, you know, the evolution of, you know, politics itself is just this whole like entity of its own. And, you know, the fact that we're so interconnected as a society, people are more informed and more educated, and yeah, I think that he would be, if he could come now, looking back of everything that he did in service to our nation, would be incredibly proud of himself. I know I'm proud of him. But then I wonder, like, what would he, given everything that he experienced and went through, and like, so challenging, but given all that and seeing where we've brought ourselves to now, what would be his sensibilities in terms of like the logical, you know, breakdown of the problem? well, what makes sense in terms of like how can we, really kind of lay to rest this sense of, racism that still exists and these systemic oppressions that still exist. And what might we be able to do from the perspective of, why we have so much cultural infighting with people is because we have opposing ideals and different perspectives and perceptions, and we're offering different propositions to the world, and where we stand in our life and lived situation and where we're trying to go. Like, these things are not always, similar enough for us to catch on of like, you understand where I'm coming from, sort of thing. And so we have these contentions, and things are much more heated than they have ever been because of our connectivity. I wonder how he might logically resolve how to turn this thing that has turned into like, negative aspect of our connectivity, our sensibilities of free speech, and, people interpreting our freedoms as the freedom to do whatever the fuck you want instead of, the freedom to do what is right. And where might he be able to come forth with like the moral legitimacy, the calm voice of reason to say like, well, that just doesn't really make sense. You have all this power, all this connectivity, all this technology, and this, evolved sense of like how democracy, little d, works. Like, why don't you set it to work to accomplish things much more effectively, than they are right now? Like, it was reasonable, totally understandable. In the founding, we had to have a republic, and we had to have representatives, because there was no way to get all of the people together at the same table to have the conversation. There had to be distinguished, designated authorities and positions of power, and there had to be certain people that made the decisions on behalf of other people. But I like to think that it's possible that being here now, seeing our capacity for connectivity, that Lincoln might logically reason that it's possible we could have a more direct democracy where we lean on our representatives less and empower the people more. And it would be able to fulfill our constitutional, arrangement that ultimately rests the power in the hands of the people. And while the Constitution, kind of leaves that out there as like all people are free and equal, it's essentially saying that the people themselves are the determinants. But it doesn't just say all you can do is vote, And in a republic, in the early days of our founding, that's really about all that we could muster the capacity to, exact, is for the people to have the power to choose who is going to represent them. And that those people, would be, intelligent and capable, and would make decisions on behalf of their constituencies, and doing so in such a way that was really about making sure there was but the idea is that we could potentially have a democracy where the people are the ultimate decision makers. The power ultimately rests with the people, and they can have more direct control over their lives, and that representatives become only really necessary to intervene on our behalf. in matters to which, you know, we have individual differences, and then help us to, you know, work up from, you know, individual, you know, agency and power, and, you know, individual personal dominion, to then have the capacity to form groups in organizations, like we have unions, and then be able to coalition build around larger forms of agency that work together to get more things done on behalf of themselves and the collective best interests of those within their localities, so that their localities reflect the needs of the people, the wants of the people, the, you know, culture and the identity of the people. And then to expand out from there to local governments that, you know, kind of help to keep things operational, in terms of, you know, you individually don't take responsibility for, or ownership for, the responsibility of paving roads and wastewater treatment plants and, you know, septic systems in our sewer systems, and roadways and the lightways, and, you know, police and fire departments, and no one person does that. We have to have larger organizations that help to organize and orchestrate all of these things. And so we have local governments that perform those tasks on our behalf. And then they look out for everybody's collective best interest, and then understands we're not always going to get along. And so there's ways to reconcile those differences. And to, you know, protect people and protect property, and to uphold a standard, you know, customary sensibility of our social and civic ideals. And then understand, like, we as a larger collective of a state and its sovereignty reflects another layer of identity and individuality, and then, you know, the nation as a whole does as well. And so we need these different layers of governance to work on our behalf, to do the big things that we can't all do alone. You know, no one person can do everything, but everybody can do something. And, you know, the individual should have, you know, personal dominion to make decisions for themselves, you know, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all under the realm of their own decision making. But, you know, there's limits to everything, just as long as you're not infringing or imposing on other people, or violating the personhood of others, or, you know, doing harm or damage, or doing something that is not in the best interest of the collective, or goes out of line from the things that we have determined for ourselves, like this is the way that we're going to be as a civil society. So I think Lincoln would come in and just be like, wow, you know, you've managed to work out all these things. This is great. Good on you. But can't you see how you have to kind of like bring it on home to empower the individual, and then create the abridgment between the capacities of, you know, this republic style of government and the capacities of this democratic, you know, style of government, and then a more direct way to unite the, you know, different levels of government, so that the way we govern as a collective best reflects, you know, the way that we want to be able to be free to govern ourselves. Does that make sense? And so the idea ultimately seems to be like, I think Lincoln would come in and just be like, we need to form a more direct democracy, which is complementary to our republic, so the republic can be more effective at what it does, so it can do it best, you know. And I think that he would probably be like, man, I wish I would have had, you know, this kind of technology back in my day, of just be able to send a wide message to everybody almost instantaneously, and for all people to be able to share their opinions on it, so that we can have open conversations and dialogues and debates about it. And, you know, we can all find a way to reconcile and come to terms with it, you know, in a similar fashion, almost instantaneously. Like, man, it would be a lot easier than, you know, the way that they had to somehow, you know, establish this, you know, sensibility of this is who we are, this is what we're going to have to be about, and then transmit that information to people living all over the place, and then eventually, you know, let people reconcile that for themselves, and then have the message come back to say, okay, everybody's on the same page, so to speak. I mean, you gotta think about it like Juneteenth represents the, like, the fact that despite the Emancipation Proclamation, it took forever for these people to realize, like, oh, you've been free this whole time, you know? And shame on the slave owners at the time who decided to, you know, hold out as long as they could to deny the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of these people who were made equal, you know? And so we have so many advantages in our modern time, but there are a lot of the, like, points of contention that Lincoln had to reconcile in his time of, like, there really is, like, these concerted efforts to try to take the nation in a direction that really is not about the best interest of all parties involved. And it is not based off of the truth. It's not about promoting goodwill or establishing new friendships. You know, it's not based off of those things to which are going to be, you know, best suited for, you know, the mutual benefits of all people. And, you know, I mean, sure, it was true. Like, ending slavery wasn't what everybody wanted to have happen back in the day. Many people didn't want him to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and some were so pissed enough to the fact where they conspired to, you know, take his life. But the ideal was that the majority of Americans said, enough's enough. It's time to move on. We can't do the slavery thing anymore. We're never going to be able to control this. It's going to get out of control, you know? And the only way to, like, keep things as they are is to assert an extreme amount of violence. And then we won't be descending into barbarism, you know? And we want to be a civil society. We don't want to, you know, let the worst of us be the thing that prevails. We wanted the best of us to prevail. And we knew it was going to be a fight. We knew it was going to be a struggle, and it was going to be hard to win over certain peoples, but we were going to still try. And the whole point was to not give up on the sense that there's going to be some people that are going to really fight tooth and nail to hold on to things the way that they were. They're really going to reject this new reality. But we have to take a firm stance of saying, like, no, you know, like, we understand you may not want to be in it with us, but we really do have your best interest at heart as well. We want you to become more than what this very limited paradigm allows for you to be, you know, and shifting things so that we establish a sense of equality and fairness and inclusivity, you know, and fully integrate, you know, people of color into society as, you know, whole persons, you know, and to acknowledge them and recognize them and open space to them. And, you know, like, the whole hope was to be able to, like, give them a boost up in society, to say, like, we oppressed you for so long, we prevented you from having anything for so long, that, you know, we should do, you know, 40 acres and a mule. So it's like, here's your chance to, you know, get a leg up in society. And, you know, that's never, there's no way to make up for the horrible atrocities, you know, the terrible things that were done to slaves in America. There's no way to fully reconcile that. But there's a way to make amends, you know? There's a way to say, like, you know, we honor our past, and we don't shy away from it, we don't reject it, we don't deny it. You know, we don't try to make it out to be something that it wasn't, you know, pretend like it was fine. You know, we know it was a dark past. We made a mistake. You know, we let that mistake go on for a very long time, you know, but we're doing what we can in all the ways we can to set things right. You know, and I fundamentally believe that Lincoln had that intent in his heart. Being reelected, he was going to be like, all right, we set the stage, you know, we fought this war amongst ourselves, and now we really have to, with intention, bring us all together again. And I really think he would have done amazing things had he been allowed to live and to continue on in a full second term, you know, having the prestigious, you know, so many people respected what he was able to do as our leader to keep us united. United States of America exists today because of everything that he did. And it's not saying that he did it alone, like, you know, sole savior or something like that. But he was the one that ultimately had the power of decision making. And his sensibility between right and wrong, his sense of jurisprudence being, you know, the highest, you know, executor of the law of the land, and the one who was meant to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, you know, understanding he had tremendously difficult decisions he had to make constantly. But really, I do believe he lived out from that sensibility is like, I have to be president to all, or I'm no president at all. And he did such good work, and had he been allowed to live, I think America would be in a far better place. I really do believe we would have had a much more cordial, I guess is kind of the word, integration of African American slaves into society. I think we would have had this sensibility where people were like, you know, we're coming to terms. It's the way things are. Let's ease our way into this, you know. And some things, yes, we have to run and go fast, you know, but we have to do it all together and do it in such a way where we're, you know, healing the rifts and preventing things from getting out of hand. We don't want anybody to feel in any sensibility that they have been rejected or left behind in our mission to advance the nation. And I really think there could have been a tremendous opportunity to create, you know, a true equality-based society. You know, and not just in the sense of, you know, slaves would, you know, be able to be fully accepted as citizens. African Americans would no longer be, you know, prejudiced or segregated, but also for the sense of like everybody would have benefited from the even playing field that we would have by necessity have had established. Instead, Lincoln's predecessors, like, America has not had another president with the depths of true patriotism since Lincoln, in my opinion. And it's not to say we haven't had, you know, good leaders, and it's not to say that things haven't been accomplished in our nation, that were vital and necessary and good and grand and great. But ultimately, I don't think we have had a president since Lincoln who really saw America as this place that was worth defending, worth holding together, and worth doing the hard and necessary work to make sure that America works for everyone. Lincoln built the credibility for the capacity to find common ground in the most contentious place of our nation. I mean, even when you think of the Revolutionary War, there were many people that were like, nah, cool, we'll just leave things the way they are. And a lot of people that were fighting to keep things the way they were, maybe because it worked out for their best interests, or they were too afraid to be able to fight for their liberties and freedom. But, ultimately there was this way to coalesce the entire population enough around to say, like, it is worth fighting for, so we don't have to live through this BS anymore. We deserve better than this, And not until Lincoln did we have another president that said, America really is worth fighting for, and we deserve better than this. And we can be so much more if we weren't hindered and held back and weighed down by this terrible, beast of a concept of slavery, And Lincoln really pressed on it so much in his considerations, his thoughtful considerations. You can't look at, your freedoms as being like real and secure and justifiable and well defended if there are people that could be carved out to saying it need not apply to them. Because then that just keeps the door open for the possibilities to shove a bunch of people through that and create outsiders, and to create the faction of otherisms that could be the very things that break apart our sense of unity and togetherness. And I think Lincoln did a really good job of recognizing he had to, weigh and measure everything against the rule of new, and understand that there were going to be things that he was going to want to accomplish that were just not feasible technically at the time. But given, finally settling the war is over, and having that clean slate, and then having this like malleable, it's like Play-Doh, this malleable thing that he used to mold and shift, like, what does the Emancipation Proclamation really truly open up for us to do? How can we remold and reshape and reconform, our sensibilities of what it means to be free people? It could have opened us to so much more potential had he been allowed to live this opportunity to really truly make America something so much more profound than we are right now. I honestly and humbly believe that had he remained our president and lived through, and then, got out of the presidency and then continued to be of service, because no doubt he would have, in some form or fashion still been of service of helping to foster this new world he was birthing, under his stewardship and care, and to use, the prestige that he established with his capacity to lead the nation back into unity, to lend that credibility to other people who would have been following behind him, in his trailblazing, to be able to bring more people along, You know, he would have lended his credibility and his prestige and helped other people raise up in the ranks to give a voice to reason and to, you know, continue to solidify and reaffirm and do the good and necessary work to lead everybody together in their own individual ways through, you know, coalitions and unions and, you know, organizations and these sorts of things, so that we were all moving together in a familiar direction, you know, being, you know, fresh off this wild ride of the, you know, craziness of a war, infighting, and the fresh sensibilities of, like, you know, slavery is no longer a thing, and now we have lots of work we got to do to set things right. And, you know, how do we recover as a nation and heal and, you know, to resolve our differences? Because, you know, it's not like, you know, you can't moralize the world through law. You have to change hearts and minds in a different way, you know, and you do that by, you know, creating the intimacies of the art of living together in cities. And understand some people can't be near each other, you know, and some people, you know, really need to be, you know, brought in to integrated so that our communities better reflect the sensibilities that America really is, a diverse and equitable, you know, an inclusive land of potentials and possibilities. And there would have been so much work to do on those fronts, and I really believe that Lincoln could have made a tremendous I will call it just like this, you know, gift of potential. He would have set us up for so much success, you know. But even with his life being cut short, everything that he did, he set us up for some really great success. And I like to think in my good work, as I consider, like, you know, how to create a collective cultural shift of the whole of humanity to align us and attune us with an ever more healthy, sustainable, just, and peaceful world, where America really can work for everyone without the disadvantage of anyone, so that everybody gets to live the good life and nobody's being kept behind or left behind, you know, and take on the responsibilities of making sure our society operates malleable, adaptable, mobile, efficient, stable, resilient, fortified, you know, and we're doing the good, hard, and necessary work of figuring out how we can establish a criterion echelon of society so that, you know, for everybody, here's a standard of the good life that we sustain and maintain and operate and work out to make sure that, you know, everybody's living at that standard. So we provision, we accommodate, we steward, we support, we care for people so that they are living the good life. And all of this work that has to be done to make that function, you know. We don't have time for infighting about stupid, petty BS. Cultural, you know, infighting about, you know, things that don't matter. You know, if anything has been learned in, you know, the past decade of politics, you know, given especially our technological, you know, advancements and the shifts of the mainstream, you know, media and information channels and communication networks, that, you know, people move on really fast and they tend to forget, you know, things that happen just, you know, some people don't care even about tomorrow, and many people forget what happened last week because there's just so much happening all the time. It's just like, how do you keep up with it all? And so we're in this, like, really struggling place. Is like, how can you create a consistent, coherent narrative that everybody can agree to, you know, so we can remain on the same page somehow. But there's hope in that too, as messed up as that is and how it works against us in so many ways. It all works to our benefit because of the fact that, you know, if we give people the thing that is like, you know, like, pay attention, look over here, shiny thing, whatever, enough people would pay attention to that. And if you can just consistently entertain, you know, the hearts and minds of people, you can get them to follow along with you know, with a story, you know, a shared collective story that we tell together that is resonant with this sensibility of, you know, this greatest potential, this highest ideal for America, you know. And our government should really be about creating the grand strategy of helping everybody to remember who we are as a nation and what we're trying to work on together, you know, and to call everybody to serve, to be a part of that. I mean, I can imagine, like, how did Lincoln, you know, delegate to his, you know, subordinates a common, cohesive, resonant message that's like, go forth and freedom go with you, and help to share this message with everyone else to remind them why we do this, why it's going to be hard, and yes, but it's worth it. It is so worth it, you know? Like, imagine what he had to do in order to hold it all together for us. I mean, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And I just look to that with so much inspiration of, like, informing my, you know, logics of how I'm trying to work out my policy frameworks that can really be that message, you know, that's coherent and consistent that we can share with everyone, that can be our, you know, we are the living answer to what does America stand for, you know, and we embody the sensibilities that America really does work for everyone, because you can look at your life and say, yeah, this is working out for me. It may not all be perfect right away. It takes time, you know, and you always have to have something that, like, captivates people to make them think, like, you know, like, don't get stuck in the rut to think, like, you know, you forget to be grateful for everything that you have. You know, we are so fortunate and so blessed in America. A lot of bad shit's happening right now. A lot of rights are being infringed. A lot of harm is being done. And unfortunately, it's coming at the direct orders of the current federal administration. But despite all of that, we have each other. And we care. And we want for better things for ourselves and for our children. You know, and we're all working it out in our own little ways, and we are becoming very, very resilient. We are learning through the experience of what it takes to navigate a very, very challenging world that is becoming, you know, based in scarcity, while we're living amongst a bunch of people that are, you know, in the controls, in determining, you know, decision-making roles or whatever, that are operating as if, you know, the waste is growth is, you know, an ever, you know, continuum that they're going to be able to, you know, prop up. Like, they don't see that there's a limit to that. And they're operating as if, you know, expedient fixes will always be there, you know, instead of recognizing there's a breaking point and we're on trend for that. And, you know, the world's becoming more scarce and, you know, more divisive. And the only way that we're going to make it through as a nation if we find a way to unite and to shore up all of our weaknesses, to empower all of our people, and to get them ready to, you know, make it through the very, very challenging times ahead. You know, but to do so with a sense where, like, it's not desperate, it's not fearful, it's not living in a sense of lack. We need to create a sensibility of comfortable conservation where we live in the sensibilities of the good life, and this is abundance, but it's within reason, you know? There's limits to everything. There's more than enough for everybody's need, but there's not enough for everyone's greed. That's what's creating the scarcity, is the greed and the hoarding, and the selfishness and the self-servedness of this deviant echelon of society, the people who deviate from, the sensibilities of what is in the best interest for everybody, And so when I think about it in my head and I'm informing these policies and I'm looking to, like, how did Lincoln reconcile, these two different versions of America and somehow be able to bridge the gap and difference between that, because it's very much the challenge that lays before us, ahead. It's kind of like a new version of a civil war, but not in a sense of like we're going to be infighting with one another and violence and guns and, there's battlefronts and none of that stuff. It's more like civility, How are we going to, advance civilization and to retain a civil society, to, conform to domestic order and not let things be led into chaos and mayhem and pandemonium like President Pandemonium is doing. Bring it on back home to the sense of like, we are America, This is what we stand for, We are united, and our union is this very fragile and delicate and precious thing, and it has to be treated with care. And so, on this 12th day of Black History Month, I really wanted to hold space with profound just appreciation and respect and love for President Abraham Lincoln, our 16th President of the United States of America, because Black history is American history, and without what Lincoln did on behalf of African Americans, our nation would be very different right now. In fact, I believe our nation would have dissolved a long time ago. Dissolution was the only path had we not chose to do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons in the right way. And abolished slavery and set a new course for a new path for America. That was the right thing to do, And so thinking about it, it's just like, again, he wasn't perfect. And I'm not trying to like wash over all of the things that he did that ended up, creating, tripping points down the line. And had he come to his senses sooner, things probably would have been, easier to reconcile, And again, it's not like he was like, this proud champion for Black liberation. It was more along the lines of like, he was reasoned with, and he was a logical man, and it made sense. Looking at the long arc of American history, he could tell we were going nowhere fast. If we didn't, diverge from that continuum of negative outcome consequences, And he presented us this viable alternative, and he set a trajectory for a continuum for America that had the potential for peace, And to me, that's just incredible and very praiseworthy, and why he will always remain my most favorite president of all time. And I will continue to take inspiration from him. Also knowing that how he inspired other presidents that came after him, that to me is like so much of the respect that I have for many presidents thereafter. is the sense that, they saw what he was able to do and really recognized the value of that, in terms of like the job of POTUS is the hardest job in the world, because you are ultimately responsible for the entire world, and that's confidence, not cockiness. I never confuse those two. America really is, even when we falter and we're a really shitty version of ourselves right now, we're still leaders of the free world. And freedom is faltering all across the globe right now, everywhere. And so to think ourselves immune from it? No. Of course it's happening here. Why? Because America is the best experimentation laboratory for us to figure out how to reconcile all the BS and fix it. So we can get back to this freedom-loving, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for everybody. Set things straight globally. We can't consider ourselves to be immune from this virus that's, of hate and intolerance, and greed and corruption and just evil that is festering everywhere. We're not immune from it here in America. But we are in a very, very unique position. If we understand what it's going to take in order for us to shed off, this old version of ourselves and rise up a new and better version. We know how to diverge from a continuum of our nation going the wrong way, in such a way where we can still uphold our sensibilities of the integrity of our founding principles. So what's happening here is by necessity, and I say it's by design. Of civilization is calling to us right now. Please take ownership. Please take responsibility. Please do the right thing. Somebody, solve for this karmatic retribution of time, Put an end to it before things get out of hand. And I'm not in any way trying to paint America as if like the global savior, as if like other people aren't going to have to do good, hard, and necessary work to reconcile this on their behalf too. But they would be empowered so much more if America took extreme ownership of restoring integrities of freedom and liberty and justice for all globally. Do the hard work, take care of ourselves, absolutely. Shore up our weaknesses, get our own home in order, so that we are empowered with the highest capability to be there for our fellow humans, to be there for our allies, to be there for the people who are struggling with being able to shed off this old version of themselves that's violent and cruel and based in hatred and is leading to their own ruin. They don't need us to save them, but they do need us to help them so that they can help themselves, so that they can help others. And America has a unique position and capability of doing that. That's proven by the fact that so many nations right now are scrambling to figure out how are they going to make it in the world now that America is led by a president that is choosing to abandon them all. Abandon the rule of law, abandon our alliances, abandon our agreements, abandon our long-standing values and beliefs. All of that's being abandoned by POTUS 47, President Pandemonium. And his entire administration is all in on just totally, undoing the world global order, because they're ran by a bunch of, deviant elitists who think they're going to be the ones that are going to come out on top of it all. But they're in for the rude awakening of knowing that they're nothing without us, the good people of the world. And we have an opportunity to diverge, much like America had to diverge, to choose a better way, choose a new path, and start investing our time, effort, and energy into that paradigm, into that continuum, into that good, engineering of good outcomes, and no longer, participate in, the prevalence of this very distorted, path that leads ultimately to ruin. And all these other nations that are realizing, oh, America is no longer on our side. What are we going to do? How are we going to make it? They're coming to terms with the fact that, like, they for so long relied on the comforts of believing that America was always going to have their back and be in their corner. And now they're realizing that may not be the case so long as POTUS 47 is in power. But it's good that they shore up that weakness, become more self-reliant and self-determined and self-sufficient. Not just for the case of, like, this mindless radicals leading America right now and abandoning everybody and becoming extremely selfish, but also for the fact, like, America overburdened prevents America from being able to be there for people in authentic ways that only we can be. So if we're overstretched, because other people aren't pulling their own weight, it's going to bring us down. And you bring us down, you're creating this, like, black hole that everything's going to be sucked into. And then ultimately will be everybody's demise. So it's the, help me to help you so that you can help others, so I can continue to help you and everybody else. And this sensibility of we're all in this together, mutual respects, mutual interests, mutual benefits, mutual securities, mutual respects, mutual trust. And I think that there's a lot of potential to reconcile that and overcome once people start realizing, like, we need everybody at their best if we ever stand a chance, to overcome. So with that, again, I'm so grateful to be able to spend this time to just honor, respect, and appreciate President Abraham Lincoln. I recall, I took a train trip across country. I went from Detroit to Chicago and then across back to the West Coast on train. And in waiting for my train ride to depart in Chicago, I had like quite a few hours between my arrival and my departure. And so I ended up going for a walk around Chicago, which Chicago is beautiful, beautiful. The architecture, the people, like the sounds and the smells, and like all the incredible places. I mean, I walked the streets and I met so many incredible people. Like, I remember there was this amazing barbershop that I went into, and it was just like, I just have to come in here and experience the space because it's just so magnificent. And apparently that barbershop had been there for like ever. It was great. And I loved it. And the experience of just like, it was winter time, so it was cold. It was actually around this time of year, and late January, early February, and I was walking around, the streets of Chicago, and I clocked it. I was like, I know how fast I can walk. I can tell I can go this many miles, and I was like, what is in proximity of the train station that I can get to, and I want to see as much as I possibly can in the short amount of time that I had. And I just by happenstance, I was determined I was gonna get to the water. I wanted to go and just be able to look out. It was like the water, and then be able to look in on the city. And the path that I chose to walk, was just by happenstance. But um, I ended up walking by a statue of Abraham Lincoln, and I was like, oh, happenstance, this is amazing, you know, universe is so funny, it's just like everything falls in place, and I was thrilled. And I sat there in this like beautiful little like coved area, and it was like concrete like seating sort of thing, and I sat there and I made a little picnic lunch for myself, and I just sat there and enjoyed being in that space of this like place that was, you know, honoring and memorializing Abraham Lincoln. And it was just such a magical moment for myself. Like, I felt like connected to every single person who had ever been there to appreciate that statue in honor of Abraham Lincoln. And you know, it was such a prideful moment for myself. I mean, I took a million pictures, of course, and so when it comes back up on my timeline, I am just overjoyed, you know, because by happenstance I ended up coming across this beautiful, amazing, wonderful statue of my most favorite of all time presidents. And on this random, totally, you know, spontaneous adventure that I chose to go on, and, you know, had I not, you know, chose to wander the streets and aimlessly going places, you know, trying to find my way to get to the waterfront, I happened across it, and I was blessed. And I have never been to Washington, D.C. before. But I am compelled to go. There's something in my heart that's calling me to go there, and I have this sense of like, that's where I need to go, and I have such a strong determination. I cannot wait to go see the Lincoln Memorial, because I've seen it in pictures, and I've seen it depicted in various, you know, shows and movies, and, you know, pop culture references and all of these things, and I want to be there in that space and to feel the same things that I felt when I saw that statue in Chicago. I want to be there, and I want to think of everybody who ever, you know, basked in the glory of this magnificent, you know, artistic creation, and then considered what that meant for them. You know, how it honored a living memoria of this incredible president, but also the living memoria of everybody he impacted. I mean, he left a mark on our nation in a good way, and he touched the lives of so many, generation after generation after generation of people have, from his choices, have been gifted this beautiful blessing of living a life that is so much more than it ever could have been had he not done all he did on behalf of humanity and our nation. That's profound, you know? And I just pray that I can be of service to our nation on that level too. I really see so much potential. I see potential in everything, but I see so much potential in America to do extraordinary things. Like, yes, everything's shitty, and it breaks my heart every day. I wake up to some new tragedy or some new catastrophe or new craziness, you know, and it hurts my heart. I literally feel so much pain that I constantly have to reconcile. But even through all of that pain and all of that sorrow and like the heavy burden of a heart that is just completely set to care, I really care. Even with all of that, I still find the silver lining, and I find the hope, you know, and I do all I can to, you know, send love and light in the world, and to commit myself to working on resolving things. You know, I look at problems as, you know, potentials. You know, they're things that, you know, to be worked on, to be resolved. You know, it's like a puzzle, and I love puzzles. So to me, it's like this great challenge, and, you know, I find joy in that despite all of the misery and the pain and terrible things. Like, I still find joy in knowing that there's so much hope, things can get so much better. You know, and human ingenuity, man, we got everything we need to clean up this mess, you know, untangle this messiness, you know, give ourselves a beautiful open canvas of vast potential to realize, you know, our highest version and our highest ideals. And I want to be able to bring something to America and to the world that really helps us to just be so grateful. Be so grateful that we chose better for ourselves. And that it just takes a person with determination and persistence and a compassionate heart, and a really big grand strategy, and just like so much hope for the world, and want for everybody to be involved and for everything to just be set right and for forgiveness to be a part of the process and for us to heal and everybody to be made whole. Like, I really want this, you know. And so when I go to DC and I get to see Lincoln and bask in the glory of this just beautiful monument, I will no doubt absolutely fall in love. I love art. I love sculpture. I love anything that is crafted or created, and I love architecture, and I love design, and I love building things. And so, like, I take so much appreciation of, like, even the finest of details of things. You know, the positioning and the orientation with the sun and, you know, the landscape and other buildings, and it's like, I'm gonna have such a great time just taking it all in and looking to that moment, and I'm being filled with such an elated joy, because I know I'm going to take from that experience this magnificent force of love and light and goodness that's going to lead me to where I need to be. It's like it's the thing that I need to experience before anything else can unfold like it's meant to. It's like, that's the thing. I'm meant to be there. I can't explain why. I know it. And I'm on my way. And I'm looking forward to the experience. And I hope that, you know, from there, that I will be inspired to follow my heart song like I always do everywhere I go. And that it will lead me to the right people and the right places to have the right conversations, so that I can start creating the momentum behind my work, so it becomes more than just this vast potential of brilliance that I see in my head and feel in my heart and know in my mind is this is right, and really bring it forth in a way that can do this, you know, magnificent shifting of our paradigm and really do right by America. I look forward to taking in the whole DC area, but most of all to be able to spend some time with my favorite president. And with that, I'm grateful for your valuable time, attention, and consideration of everything I've said. I will continue to make space for celebration and honoring and respecting and appreciating those prominent figures and even those lesser known figures that I believe really represent this sense that I get when I think of Black History Month, again I like to call it Black Excellence Month, is this sense of just, you know, we are Americans. This is our home. You know, all we got is each other. And we owe it to ourselves and one another to do everything we can to, you know, make sure that this is the America that we all really truly deserve. And the only way that we can do that is if we honor our past with respect for everything that came before, even the worst things. So we never lose sight of what we stand for today. A nation that has evolved beyond all of that bullshit. You know? We don't hold our heads down in shame because we had a dark past in history. No. We are not who we, you know, what we did. You know, we are who we are today, who we choose to be today, how we choose to act, what we choose to do, what we act on, what we focus on, you know, what we care about, what we give, you know, voice to, what we give, you know, light to, and what we create space for. That's all that matters. All we have is today, you know. Yesterday is history, tomorrow's a mystery, and today is our gift today. So I am grateful to be able to gift you with the sensibilities of my love, respect, and appreciation for Abraham Lincoln and all that he did to be able to help to liberate African Americans from slavery and to set America on a trajectory of an ever more healthy, sustainable, just, and peaceful world. I'm grateful for your valuable time, attention, and consideration. Until next time, be well.